site for some reason.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So the AOSagenda.org is not coming up.
No, so I'm going to try it again. AOS agenda.
There's a link in the chat.
AOS2020agenda.org. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's now a link to in the chat to that PDF.
Yeah, I get a sorry that page doesn't exist, and I just used the chat link.
Yeah, I'm
I'll
not
keep
sure
trying.
what the issue is there.
And actually, when I go to the chat one, it has one of the drafts that we probably shouldn't have up. I'll just keep trying. It may be an issue with, I don't know what. We'll figure it out.
Okay, great. Here. So welcome everybody. We're just going to give it maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Last time we had quite a few people coming on right at the dedicated time, and then we'll get started. And Sophie will start us off, and then I'll lead us in and provide a little bit of background, and then we can get going on discussion. Okay, Sophie, I think we're close enough now that if you want to get us started, that'd be great.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize that these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous peoples and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in open-minded community-building collaboration, as described by the ASSW Code of Conduct shared in the chat window, which I will do just in a minute. Some logistics before we start the presentation. You have all joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to remute after speaking. How to mute on phones, you can press *6 if your phone does not have a dedicated mute button. Please keep your phone muted during the presentation and do not put us on hold. You put yourself on hold because we can hear all your typing and conversations while you aren't muted, and the hold button may cause disruptions to the presentation. To avoid the echo, if you have the option, please use headphones or a headset. If you're on the phone, please turn your computer speakers all the way down, as we can get an echo from when the phone picks up from the computer audio. To see your controls, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. You can chat and see other participants via these controls. If you have a question, type your questions into the chat window and they will be read out loud. If you need help, message the moderator via the chat tool, or use the raise the hand tool, which is accessed by opening the participant window. If you want to join in the discussion, unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. If you can send a chat message to the group, everyone, and the moderator will read the question aloud. For folks without mics, type into the chat and the chat moderator will read this question aloud. This presentation will be recorded. A video, audio file, slides, and relevant links will all be available on the agenda tab of the AOS website, which I will paste in the chat shortly. I'll now pass it off to the moderator to do an introduction and welcome the speakers.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. I just want to make sure I do have my microphone on. Yes, I do. So welcome to session 2 of Working Group 4 of the 2020 Arctic Observing Summit. I want to thank you all for joining, particularly given the challenging times that we're all dealing with at the moment, and we're sad that we are not able to have the in-person conference in Iceland. At the same time, it's probably allowed for more people to participate in the online version. So we'll be grateful for that. So you can see from, if you go to the working group tabs and go to working group 4, if you want to look at this agenda, you can find it there. But I'll just go through a little bit about the general approach that we're taking. It's relatively informal, based on experience in previous meetings and you know, the input from participants. This morning we had session 1, and you will be able at some point to access the video of that if you weren't able to join us. I have a general agenda for each session. However, as I explained in note 1 at the top, we recognize that not everyone can join every session, so they won't necessarily be able to, you know, follow on from previous. So we can, of course, talk about any topic of any interest during any session. But if you could just let us know, ideally through the chat, I think, where we'd want to go so we can manage how we have the discussion, that would be helpful. The first session was an introductory, so we went over just some overview of recent community activities. We had a couple of presentations about 2 of the white papers that were submitted, so the Anderson and the Tom Berry presentations. And Bill Manley will be presenting in this session. We had a great presentation by Sandra Starkweather on the Say on Roads process, the road mapping process. So we spent a better part, almost an hour, going over that and talking about the relationship with the data community, data initiatives, and so on. Had some discussion about relevant global initiatives, and then just overall group conversation on themes, priorities, topics of interest. Our objective in this one, we can of course go over some of those things as I mentioned, but in this session as well, we want to follow on some work that's being done over a number of months and years actually now on interoperability and federated search in particular, semantic interoperability, and Bill's going to give us a presentation on a new initiative that he'll be leading that touches on these things. So that's the idea for this session. We can add other topics. As I mentioned, we have actually quite a bit of time allocated. We have a 3-hour slot. We don't necessarily need to use those full 3 hours, but we have it available to us if needed. You'll see if you look ahead, session 3, which is tomorrow, the idea is session 3 is to focus on topics of community building, enhancing broad engagement of users, etc., and engaging with global level initiatives, which crosses over to working group 5, but we could have some specific conversations related to data. And then session 4, this is one I'm hoping that a few of you who have some interest and experience here, we want to look at emerging methods and technologies. So how do we situate things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, you know, e-science, model-based science, and so on. And then also discussions on things like end-to-end observing systems, so connecting, you know, sensor observer to right through to the long-term data preservation process in the life cycle. And then the last sessions 5 and 6 tomorrow evening and Thursday morning would be focused on some writing. So we'll probably would expect a smaller group there just to look at what we want to put into a statement that we're trying to at least develop the framework of, or the core of for Thursday morning. And then we will have time after the AOS to go out to a broader community review and so on. So before we get started, I have a few slides that I'd like to just put forward just to provide some background, particularly in relation to federated search and semantics. And then we can get into Bill's presentation. But before we get started, I just want to see if there are any questions or comments or things that people want to put out there at our start. And if you could just, if you can, use the raise hand, and if not, in our last session, we just typed in raise hand in the chat window. Okay. So just as a point of order or approach that I tend to take is I try and leave, Matt asked, is there a shared notes document? There is. Shannon is working on that, but Shannon, if you can share the URL for that, I would ask you to work with Shannon maybe through the chat window on how we go about that, because if we have maybe 10 or 12 people in there all at once, it could get a bit unwieldy. So yeah, if you can do that, and then maybe I'll continue just to give us a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar, and then we can go from there. Okay, what I was just about to say is just I will tend to leave maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds or so after a question to give people time to either speak or to put in something in the chat, and then move on from there. If it takes you a little bit longer, just feel free to jump in the chat and we'll follow on from there. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing of this screen, and I'm just going to share another screen presentation. And I realize that for some of you, this will not be particularly interesting because you've been involved or it's an area that you know, but for others it may be helpful, and it's certainly not meant to be comprehensive, just a really broad overview. So earlier today in the first session, we were going over very large sort of broad initiatives and movements and so on. So many of you will be familiar with the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think they're just helpful in terms of reminding us some of the things that we're trying to achieve in our data management initiatives and data use initiatives. On the F, or the findable side, there's been a lot of discussion for many years. I recall first working in this area and during the International Polar Year, actually, and talking about data publication and so on. And so we have one way of making data findable is through that process, you know, assigning DOIs and so on. And we have a number of different organizations, data centers, et cetera, catalogs who are using that approach as a way of making their metadata available, or the data descriptions available. Many different standards, protocols, et cetera. I mentioned DOIs. There's, you know, in my field and geographic information systems, you know, ISO 19115, more general ones like Dublin Core, et cetera. So there's a lot happening in this space. It's certainly got a lot of complexity, and we're still, I think, feeling through it as a community as to the best approaches, the best way to bring this information to end users in an appropriate and useful way. Federated search, so the idea of how do we connect various catalogs and various collections of metadata, et cetera, has been a topic of a lot of discussion within our community. We've had a number of initiatives, including things like the Arctic Data Explorer, which was developed quite a few years ago, that has brought together catalogs. That one now is sort of towards retirement, but we have others. Matt Jones, who's on, I know, leads Data One, which does a lot of work in this area. It's a network and has technology related and so on. And we're doing a lot of thinking and doing in this space. So the image there in the center is a meeting that we really sort of roll up our sleeves at, called the Polar Data Planning Summit. I'll just come back to that in a minute. Recent activities, we're touching on a relatively new standard, schema.org, and this links to a major aggregator in the form of Google Data Search or dataset search. And so at one of our meetings, we had Google come and speak to us. We were aiming to actually have Natasha Noy speak at the AOS, but she wasn't able to join us. She leads the Google Dataset Search project. But a number of us are working in this space now as a way to make the data, or sorry, the metadata visible. And that's, I think, going to be a big part of our conversation today, or at least in relation to the federated search side of things. Just in terms of how we've been going about this, at least within what I'll call the research data community, and as well as linking to Indigenous organizations and others. We had the Polar Data Planning Summit, which was in May of 2018, and that's the one where we moved to a slightly different format rather than just conference style. We had a lot of actual hands-on activity, more like a hackathon, and made some good progress both in thinking about how to do this, as well as particularly the federated search, as well as working to start some papers and things like that. We followed that not long after in November of 2018 with the Polar Data and Systems Architecture Workshop. So made some additional progress there, as well as started to look at things like data interoperability, so on. I meant to have a slide for the Polar Data Forum 3, which happened last November, but that escaped me. So there was a third Polar Data Forum. I presented on that this morning that happened in November of 2019 in Helsinki. And we had several days, just over 2 days, I think, of hackathon there, with a lot of it, the technical side focused on this, the schema.org. And recently, I think a number of us have been starting to connect to groups like ESIP, the Federation of Earth Science Information Professionals, and the Science on Schema.org initiative. So that came up in our discussions this morning as well, which I think is part of what we want to think about. So where do we go from here? What I'd like to think about here and talk about are updates, so current developments, projects, etc. Bill's actually going to introduce us to one that's just getting started, but I think intersects well with this. Anything related to priorities and work planning in terms of this effort. Partners, question mark there, actually. We have a number of partners already engaging, but are there others who need to be engaged? Approaches to collaboration. One thing that came up this morning is the idea of following up these working sessions that we've had, these hackathons, is something that's a bit more regular and frequent and virtual. Recognizing we want to have the face-to-face, but that's a real challenge at times, and particularly now. So that's something that I have on the to-do list, or as an action item to follow up on that. But we can talk about that. Vision or visions, make sure we document those, and then discussion about capacity as well, because we definitely have challenges at times. We know where we want to go, what we want to do perhaps, but trying to get the capacity to get there is a challenge. So I think I do have a few slides I could put out there for the semantic side of things, which is also on our agenda, but I'm thinking I may stop there and look to you for any questions or comments, and then we can have Bill make his presentation, and then we can come back to the semantics, which I know intersects with the search as well. So I will stop there and go back to our agenda slide. So are there any questions, comments? There are a number of you who are online who have been involved in the federated search work, and I certainly haven't been at the core of it. So if there are anything that you want to add, that would be helpful. Sorry, bear with me a moment. I'm just getting my chat window back open. Okay, what I'd like to do is invite Bill to make his presentation. I'll stop my sharing, Bill. And I think this is an example of an application that could benefit from making progress on federated search, as well as just a better understanding of what's out there in terms of metadata and all of that. So Bill, if you're prepared, you can do that.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just getting things set up real quick. Is it okay if I share my screen?
You should be able to now, yeah. So I've just stopped my sharing.
Awesome. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for a little bit of time here. I'd like to touch a little bit today on something that's linked, but a little bit different perhaps. And this was brought up a little bit in the Polar Data Forum, and then since then has progressed. And so we have a white paper that speaks to this new working group, or the need for it. But this poster is perhaps the most relevant thing. And the link's in the chat, I think. So preaching the choir a little bit, but I really do think that there has been a great deal of progress over the last decade by the Arctic data community, the polar data community, to make scientific data sets and the metadata records that describe them more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And as you all, I think, well know and understand, is that this has been accomplished mainly by the adoption of interoperable metadata standards and controlled vocabularies, and semantics technologies, and crosswalks, and federated search, and aggregation, and more. So these are lessons learned, but these lessons learned have not yet been fully applied to semantic things beyond the data set level. And by that, I mean observing assets and high order discovery level details, metadata elements, about observing sites, observing stations and observatories, research projects, ship or buoy tracks, and generally about observing networks or systems. So many of these metadata elements, these higher order discovery level details about these assets are not actually captured by data set level metadata. Unfortunately, there are a growing number of catalogs for observing assets, inventories and portals for tracking and for linking across the project to data lifecycle. But many of these catalogs are reinventing the wheel each time, resulting in apples and oranges that are difficult to harmonize or aggregate or compare. So it's a little bit like we're in the Wild West or the Dark Ages in this like extension of the data community or more within the observing community. So thus, we have formed a new working group. It's just being formed. We expect the first meeting will be in about a month. The Polar Observing Assets Working Group. And so this is being formed under the SAON Committee on Observations and Networks. And we expect it'll be working a little bit like or akin to the Federated Search and Semantics Working Groups that are under SAON ADC, but in this case under SAON Con. Roberta Pierzini with Intaros is co-chair. Oystein Godoy is strongly involved, along with a number of growing core group, and we're going to be opening up. We have opened up participation. So the idea here is to have observing related information more fair, promoting best practices for interoperability, and span a spectrum across science, planning, data management, and disciplinary science, with links to data sets where appropriately housed by data repositories. So in this way, the effort will identify strengths and gaps across multiple observing systems and clarify directions for Arctic observing. And if you all are interested, please find that PDF and click on the link at the bottom to sign up. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'm wondering, Bill, if you could expand a little bit on some of the conversations you've already been having about what you see as some of the big challenges, you know, even going down a little bit into the weeds in terms of the standards that may be out there, vocabularies, things like that, just to get us started on our conversation. And then I'd like to maybe go out to some of our participants for some comments on that.
Okay. So, let's see here. So we're really talking about higher order discovery level fields about a variety of assets. So different groups have defined or conceptualized those assets in different ways. And so there are different conceptual models. A lot of portals are dedicated to an individual theme or geographic scope, or more likely organizational scope, like one portal per network. And so it hasn't gotten further along in terms of interoperability or in terms of aggregation or federated search. I think we're a long ways away there. I could go a little bit perhaps into the individual metadata elements that are of interest here. And there are relatively few metadata standards for observing assets, if you will, for documenting observing assets. And, you know, I've considered that none of them are quite the best, really. However, as Oystein pointed out, it's actually a good thing that there are very, very few at this point, because we can more easily, develop crosswalks and translators across them. There's the project level metadata standard that came out of the Alaska Data Integration Working Group. And within that standard, it is possible to link to things like assets as a product for a project. But it's not quite right. So with RMAP and AOV, we felt like we had to expand that ADIWIG project level metadata standard, and we moved it into ISO. And with a distributed way of presenting different pieces of a metadata record at different levels so that it's dispersed appropriately. And so that's using ISO 19115-1. It is an implementation that's shared, but it's not really a standard, right? And but I think there's a lot of hope actually with WIGOS Lite, which is coming out of WMO, particularly for meteorological assets. And so, you know, for this working group, I think we're all on board that it should not reinvent the wheel or create another wheel or a new standard or something. And so instead, it's people at this observing level who either have an interest or a familiarity and expertise in metadata management. They come together and be a forum for awareness, and I think also developing recommendations for implementation. A lot of these individual networks, they're happy if there was just an easy way, an interoperable, so fair way to just more save some time and effort and just quickly run with something that's presented to them. And we're a lot further behind in the observing community, if you will, about sharing structured information interoperably compared to the data community. I don't know if that really addressed your question.
Yeah, it does, Bill. It just sort of expanded a little bit, but thank you for that. And with that, I would like to go out to our participants, see if people have any initial thoughts, questions, suggestions, things that you're thinking if you're working in this space with your group or have been touching on this space, and how that might link to what Bill is putting forward. And I do see a chat here. So Pierre, did you want to maybe just expand on your chat?
Yeah, sure. So I think in this catalog space, it keeps coming up quite often. It was identified in the previous session too. I know that I'm working with IODE, so UNESCO IOC, for the UN decade. And again, the same idea, to catalog data sources and initiatives. And there are many projects and groups doing the same thing. As far as I know, nobody's really satisfied with the kind of exchange packages, like the metadata specifications for cataloging these things. So I think in this case, if we can get together those groups, bring them all together and say, you know, open call through RDA, through ESIP, through whatever networks we have, and saying, hey guys, let's get this settled. Let's get this at least at a state where we can start a new round of critique and revision. It may not be a bad thing. because everybody needs it, but there are so many leaders leading in different directions that I think a kind of collaborative push here is needed.
Yeah, that's good to hear that there's recognition elsewhere. And then I'm a little hesitant to go. Yeah, I'll get into that. And sorry, Mark. I'm a little hesitant to promote the idea of creating a new standard, but I think at least we can be aware of interoperable ways of using existing standards, if not explore the gaps in existing standards. So Mark brings up a good point, I think, is and this is not beyond our vision, and that is that there needs to be cross-fertilization, cross-linking, so that we avoid silos and we are aware of and incorporate lessons learned and approaches and best practices from a broader community. So from RDA and ESIP and more, GEOS and GEO. And so the RDA IADOPT interest group is one that's relevant here. But as far as I can tell, a lot of the discussion there is about data set level metadata. And let's see here. They have a great spelled out title, but it's parameter descriptions rather than descriptions about assets.
Yeah. So I'm a member of that group, and but it's similar in the same way like we just described. It's bringing together people who have already kind of developed models for parameter descriptions and trying to say, okay, we're supposed to be the interoperability people, but our own resources don't interoperate. Let's fix that and move on.
Okay. Well, is it the same people? So a lot of these network catalogs of assets that exist, and there are some, I'm thinking it seems to be that there might be data managers involved, but a lot of them, no, not really. It's some of them are just, spreadsheets on PDFs or on a website, the tables on a website that have different columns and they're not utilizing best practices in metadata management. So it's, this is a weird animal at the edge, I think, of the data community, overlapping some with the observing community, if you will. And so that's, I guess, one concern or observation I have. But there's no doubt that the people within the data community have a lot to contribute here. And so it seems like there's a space that could be utilized well here within the polar communities to have our own monthly meetings and to discuss and come together on all this, apart from but connected to international efforts. What do you think about that, Pierre? It's kind of like how there's a polar semantics working group.
Yes,
and yet
yes.
There's more going on.
Sure. I mean, at a high level, naturally, I think that's where it needs to go. But often by the time we interface, we've already developed something, and I think we need to move a little bit earlier. And this is a good opportunity because your working group hasn't yet convened. We're still formulating the strategy for the ocean catalogs, which will probably overlap. And I heard a number of other projects which are winding down right now that need a place to kind of place all of the work they did in network mapping. And perhaps this is the opportunity, but I'll hand over to Peter again. This is becoming a bit too late, but we can certainly follow up if you wish.
Very much so. And I'm really hoping that the, that you and the semantics group and the federated research group and folks are involved as you see fit. One thing here that is a topic to maybe bring up a little bit later on is that as part of AOS here and the overall goals for AOS moving forward tied to the Stay on Roads process, et cetera, is to identify and implement essential variables, in particular essential Arctic variables. That's right, Arctic essential variables. And that, to make sure we do it the right way, that needs to involve the semantics folks. and in particular, I think the Semantics Working Group, to take advantage of rather than reinventing control vocabularies, and to do it interoperably.
So I'll jump in there. I will hand it back to Sophie just after this, but I see Matt has his hand up, so I'll ask Matt to speak, and then I have a couple of thoughts as well.
I was just going to say that there are a variety of groups that have started down the modeling path for basically the concepts surrounding platforms and observations. And so both the SSN model, the sensor network model, and the GeoLink vocabularies have extensive modeling under kind of design pattern kind of approaches to this. And so Bill, you've said a couple times that you think that there really hasn't been as much work on this as there has been in the data set space, but I think they're much more firmly linked than that. And I think there's some really good work that we should be building upon. I appreciated what Pierre said about how hard it is to get communities to come together, but it's also hard to do that from the top down. I don't know how we can wave a magic wand and suddenly have everybody go, we're going to follow this one approach. Everybody, evaluates the landscape and decides what they're going to adopt based on the sort of current state of the art at any given point in time. And we just sort of move our way forward that way. And I think we're going to continue to do that. So I'm personally supportive of the much more grassroots kind of approach where you get groups of people who are at a good place to collaborate and get them to come to agreement through like the Polar Semantics Working Group. That's a relatively small group of people. They can really focus on a particular domain and come to some agreement. It's definitely not trying to achieve some sort of global architecture, which is I think a much harder thing to pull off, and really, it gets I think challenging because of so I would argue that keeping it small and focused and sort of working from the bottom up is a much better way to grow our way into interoperability than the other way around.
Great, yeah, that sounds great. And then you touched a little bit on sensor level metadata, and so some of those standards I think are just are valuable for sure, but to make some progress about networks and platforms or sites anyway, and it's helpful to have something that's higher order or discovery level. Yeah, but that's, and part of this is awareness building for myself as well, or for individuals that are across networks to become aware. And so some of these things you bring up are really helpful.
Yes, and thank you for that. One thing I'll just add that I'd like people to continue down this line of thinking about how we do connect what is valuable and necessary. So we've talked, Bill, about the need to have this convening at our Arctic community level, but recognizing this is not specifically an Arctic problem. But we want to be able to connect it out. So I'm seeing some really good stuff in the chat about staying focused to get some work done in perhaps under the IODE and the other initiatives that Pierre and others have mentioned. And I know that's been quite productive, I think, for a number of projects I've been on recently, is having that focus. Maybe as an action item, I'm seeing in the semantics group, we could talk about using this as a use case or a working project, a nice concrete one, because I think we've been doing some interesting work there, but we could use something that really focuses the effort. So additional thoughts along those lines, and I see Jay had his hand up, so.
Yeah, I wanted to follow on with what Matt was saying about the focus, and also, Peter, what you said. Can we identify one or two areas that we as a group, as a consensus, think should be the first areas that we should address?
So I'll say verbally that oceans is really quite appealing from the perspective of this emerging CCADI group in Canada. We just had a meeting about a month or so ago, and we're bringing in the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System as partners. A lot of our partners are doing that, and we have dedicated resources for semantics as well as standardization, and also the project that we're working on together, Jay and Pierre, called Capardis, CAPARDUS, and I'll put a link in there in a moment. We're looking at standards in that and have some capacity there. So if we could come to some conclusion on a focus area, that would, I think, be really useful.
If I could jump in with one more thing. This is starting up Understand Con, but we didn't want to limit it to just being Arctic. And, you know, just like the Federated Search and Semantics Working Groups are polar, we're hoping that this is polar, and this follows on some of your suggestions. And so Taco in particular, and we want to reach out to SUSE and SCADM and target invitations, or you know, it'll be open, but it'll be important to engage, I think, the southern latitudes as well.
Great. Any additional comments, thoughts, particularly around, Mark, you mentioned the RDA initiative. It'd be good if we could learn a little bit more about that here, expand a little bit on that. I see the chat, but if you could maybe summarize that. But are there other spaces that we need to be engaging in with this effort? You know, OGC comes to mind possibly, and if there's anybody on with a bit more current experience with OGC, you know, is this where we need to be connecting as well, or others?
Well, was that to me?
Just yeah, if you could just a little bit on the RDA I adopt, and just RDA in general, because RDA has come up many times over the last couple of years. We co-hosted our polar meeting there in 2017, I think, in Montreal. And we keep coming back to that, is how do we make sure we keep our community coordinated, but that we don't create an Arctic or polar silo. So maybe a little bit of your thinking about what's happening in that space.
Well, Pierluigi or Ruth or others can definitely talk about iAdopt more. It does sound like, and Pierluigi's right, it's focused more on the parameters than on the assets. But I think it might be a suitable sort of model in that they're sort of doing a survey of what's being currently done and trying to harmonize. And it sounds like that's sort of what Bill wants to do as well. But then in the chat discussion, it sounds like, and with Matt's comments, you know, we really should start with something focused. And it seems like the oceans area is something that is definitely a place to start. I'm not super expert in this. In terms of RDA, RDA would be a forum in which we could bring these various communities together. I mean, I think it's got the recognition, it's got the convening power, it's got the global reach, and that, you know, the Arctic is one example of ocean observables or observing assets. But I think I defer more to the people who are more steeped in this space, but just note that RDA would be a good vehicle to allow some of this coordination, if indeed we're going to do like Pierluigi suggests and try and harmonize or create a new cross-cutting standard.
Bill.
One other thing is, I'm going to lower my hand. Is RDA iAdopt. You know, they recently had the RDA plenary, and there was a plenary talk by this group, and I believe that's available as a recording.
Yeah, it is, and it was basically an overview of where they are to date in terms of surveying parameter observations.
Yeah.
And so I think, my comment notwithstanding, I'm not sure that that's necessary. I mean, I think some awareness and connection there is good, but I don't think it's addressing your problem.
You know, it's interesting to see all these different groups, how they operate dynamically, and there's different ways of going about things. So it's helpful to see.
Well, and if you're talking about parameters, often, and I think it was Allison mentioned something in the chat, that, you know, it sometimes matters from whence the parameter was measured. you know, is it a proxy measurement? Is it direct measurement? Is it in situ? Is it some sort of remote sensing? So I think, you know, there does need to be some sort of connection there.
And there are different approaches being made by different disciplines, or thematic groups. And so, yeah, Pierre Luigi has something else.
Go ahead.
You know, just some impressions. So, you know, I'm a member of a couple of RDA working groups, kind of peripherally. I'm not so deep into it, but I adopt, I'm involved in certainly. So I think it's a good vehicle, but I also have the feeling, and I could be wrong, that it has a lot of procedure associated with it, reports, working group, you know, there's an overhead, shall we say. So I think that's fine. I think we can cope with it as long as we sort of set a reasonable amount of delivery. It's a good place to advertise that work and for it to be on the radar of other people so that they come together. So I think certainly an interest group to cover the region, you know, the polar regions, perhaps with the link to the oceans, is a good sort of stake to claim, shall I say. But I would beware a little bit about the overhead there, but I'm sure there's a way to navigate it as long as we're aware of that variable.
Thank you. I'm just noting Matt's comment as well about I adopt, you know, catching up with community already where they're already headed in terms of parameter vocabularies. One thing I'm thinking about is just the practicalities of this. And Bill, I'm sort of thinking about you going ahead, trying to get the work done efficiently. And I know starting with my time with SCADM in the Antarctic many years ago and now with ADC, one of our challenges has been to try and make all these connections. So recognizing there are a whole bunch of different spaces this could be done in. So, you know, maybe a way forward is through the semantics group, if we can link that as we've sort of started to talk about more formally to your initiative, to the asset mapping. There are a number of people in that group who are in turn connected to these other initiatives, whether it be iAdopt or WMO or whatever, and then use that as a way to keep the connections going without having to spread ourselves too thin in terms of formal interaction until we know that that's where we want to go. And by we, I mean, I guess more your new working group.
That sounds great. And there's a lot of individuals here that would be awesome to lean on. I do want to bring up one other point, and that is that part of the challenge I think that we have moving forward is that we've talked about silos, for example, between the polar communities and the global communities, whatever. But there really are silos between the Arctic data community and the Arctic observing community. And, you know, that's reflected in the fact that there are different IARPIC teams, and there's different SAON committees, and there's different groups of people. So, you know, that, for example, right now there's a lot of talk about essential variables. And I think a lot of those people who are promoting the idea of essential variables are not aware of control vocabularies and ontologies that are relevant here. And so there's no way around having to work within, you know, defined communities, but there needs to be some careful cross-fertilization between the observing communities and the data communities.
And I think that's well recognized, Bill, and something we talked about this morning in our session when Sandy presented on the Roads Initiative, and then it just keeps going up from there as well. And that's the area that I would like to sort of make some you know, progress on under AOS is coming up with some concrete ideas on how to best do that. I've been saying it for a number of years within the SAON and IAS context as well. And I think we're trying to make some progress there. It is a challenge, but you know, I see Lil or Andy has been putting in some links here on maybe some ideas on how to do that. But you know, as soon as we get into saying, well, let's do it under this umbrella, there are other umbrellas. But I'm seeing the SAON Roads process as it matures, and I know there's some funding coming with a couple of funded projects that are coming online, that you're part of one under NSF, that, you know, it might be that sort of sweet spot now where we can hit it, and we have a lot of people in there who are in turn engaged with, you know, IARPIC and other international initiatives. But yeah, any additional thoughts on that in terms of the place or the venues to have these more integrated conversations?
Hi, this is Allison Gaylord. I have a question, I guess, with regards to the place. I see that there's a real lack of incorporating the human observations in a meaningful way. And in terms of the place, I just don't see us capturing that audience in a technically heavy work group that, you know, I just may not engage that community. And so I think that's something we need to be aware of, and I'm not sure how to effectively to do that.
Any thoughts on that from our participants?
Just the same, really. We have good progress with people who are using sensors or like automated data things, but when it comes to smaller subgroups of our institutes, it's often really, really hard to motivate them to get away from Excel and to think about this. It just, there's no reward structure for them. You know, we talked about data papers and things, but often it's just like, why would we do that? We can still publish Nature papers without it.
Well, and I'm thinking of programs such as here in Alaska, the LEO program, the Local Environmental Observer Program. I've attended some of their sessions, and I think the work they're doing is very interesting and valuable. But you know, we've been so focused on in situ assets, and I think most of the efforts that I've seen in this area that are developing catalogs are focused on in situ assets. And if we're going to try to incorporate human observations in a meaningful way, what does that mean? I mean, are we including elders as assets? Are we including communities that have liaisons that report observations as assets? I don't know, I just throw that out there for thought. And Peter, you may have more ideas on this than anyone with your experience with Aloha.
Okay, I will come back to that. I noticed that I think it's Lil and/or Andy has raised hand.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Allison and Peter. I'm a little concerned in that this science of community-based observing, we've been doing this for about 20 years, and we've developed a really robust science. So in the best practices report, and we have about 35 publications, and I'll try and not bombard anybody with all those publications, but we actually did an analysis of types of community and human-based observing networks. So the LEO network is not a community-based observing network. It falls more on sort of the indigenous observations part of the continuum. There is a workflow that we're going to go through tomorrow. And the rigorous observing networks involve looking at data that are derived from different sensor suites. And so it doesn't matter if the data are coming from a satellite or a human, it's that there is a consistent workflow across all of them. So I don't want to go reinventing the wheel. There is a very clear process for integrating human-based observing networks with the data coming in from other instruments, you know, all the way from seafloor to space. And in terms of what makes a good observer, there's also an established set of criteria. So I think it's really great. And as I'm mixed race myself, and I think it's really great that we are doing a lot with Indigenous communities. We need to do that. We also need to not forget that there are millions of people living and working in the Arctic. And indigeneity by genetics is doing everybody a disservice. So what makes a good observer? There's a set of metrics for intimacy. with the Arctic. That could be it could be a hunter, indigenous hunter, but it also could be a commercial fisherman. It could be somebody who lives in, in Tromsø and is a mariner. So I just want to get away from the genetics of things and get into the science of observing.
Okay, thank you, Lil. I would be interested, I know you don't want to bombard us here in the chat window, but maybe choosing some of the key publications that you're thinking of, because we are working on a statement and other resources, et cetera. So I'm quite familiar with some of your work, but probably not as current as I need to be. So that would be great for us to have for the record if you just want to email it or provide it in some other way. I see Jonathan has his hand up. Allison, your hand is up, so I'm not sure if that was a previous hand up or another, but if it's another, just keep it up there and we'll go to Jonathan.
Hi, yeah, this is Jonathan. I wanted to touch back on the proliferation of standards and different venues to have those either bottom up or top down disseminated, especially for these sensor networks and assets. And I think I might not be familiar with the ones that were referenced, but things like sensor ML are at a much more granular level. And generally I see the value of the sensor, the assets, metadata to be part of the larger picture. So managing metadata components for their own sake, following their standards, but then connecting those pieces so we have complete metadata to describe the sensor that produces the long-term data record, for example. And in isolation, I don't think these things will make a lot of sense, but even looking at the sensor ML, which is very detailed, that connects to the asset record. The asset record connects to the data record, and so on. And having those pieces, having an architecture, I think is what we are in need of. Having those pieces drawn together would be very valuable. And one last note, I know in our department, the Department of the Interior, we're trying to do this kind of asset based inventory for all of our data. And I think this is a good approach to proceed. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just looking for others. So this is something, it seems, Bill, as well, the reason I guess Jonathan is engaging in your initiative, and there'll be others to talk about some of these things at the implementation level. I know in the CCADI initiative, we're looking at that right now is sensor observation services that are in place, also the evolution of those types of things. There's now the OGC sensor things API, and that seems to be kind of emerging as maybe a follow-on to SOS and sensor ML and so on. So just tracking all of those spaces and seeing how they fit within the model that you're thinking about. So.
This has been very helpful. And you'll be able to share the recording as well as the chat later. Is that right?
Yeah, all of this is being recorded. I'll check in on Slack with the organizers. I actually see Heather is on right now, but I haven't had a chance to check if this morning's is up yet or how we're going to be doing that. But that is my understanding, is they'll be made available through the site. One thing I would like to say, just in terms of the comments that were made about the need to connect in the community, expanding, removing the silos, and that is for these types of meetings. I do think we want to start thinking a bit more about that. We do need to have these conversations, I think, with communities of practice and sort of more focused, with data people and so on. But this week I just wish I could clone myself, because I'd very much like to be in Working Group 3 and Working Group 1 and Working Group 5 and so on. And so there's practical issues there, but just maybe that's something that we can think about as the AOS writ large, is how do we make sure that these are connected, and perhaps we can focus this time around on the post-meeting synthesis, but also for the future planning.
Hear, hear. And I think we all want you to clone yourself many times over.
Well, not so much. I think a lot of us are in this situation now where we're saying, hey, this isn't really a data discussion. It's not an observing discussion. It's not a community discussion. It's all of those things. And so we need to do that, as I said, but to separate at some level. But there's also a lot of value, I think, in bringing it together. So we will do our best, but that's something that I think I will add to my notes for the synthesis or the statement that we'll work on towards Thursday. Okay, great. Any other comments along that thread, along working with Bill? I see we definitely have some clear action items, particularly in linking the semantics group with you, Bill, and some other things. But any other general or specific comments on that? Oh, I see Matt has a hand up. Matt, go ahead.
So Bill, I really appreciate your wanting to really extend the formal modeling and community agreement on how to deal with assets and sampling and that stuff. And I think it's a great effort to try to formalize that. There has been a lot done in this space. I think it's pretty fragmented, but there's a lot of really good work out there to build upon. And I guess I would just emphasize that I think that really staying connected to the data space and not doing it separately from that would be really important. I think the sampling descriptions and projects are really the other side of the coin from the data cataloging and data acquisition side of things. And so many of those standards touch upon what you want to do. And I think it would be really great to just try to work in concert. There's been, like I pointed out, a couple of groups that have really tried to formalize some of the sensor and sensor deployment and measurement kinds of standards. And I think they're really relevant to what you want to do. And I'd hate to see us start with that stuff again. And I know you won't, because I know how well informed you are across all of these things, but still there's a lot of space out there. So it's good to make sure that we try to embrace some of these other standards that have already gone through a lot of work.
That's great. That's great. And, this is more here than any one individual can do. It's about bringing together for awareness. That's what this working group is about. And hopefully you all who know such relevant information from different directions we can all come together.
Yeah, agreed.
Agreed.
It would be so nice to have, for example, from the data catalogs and repository interfaces and the aggregation sites that we have for data, to really be able to link back to projects and the physical resources that are out in situ in the Arctic, and be able to make sure we have those cross connects. And so I think your vision for this is fantastic, and we need to figure out how to operationalize it. But yeah, right now there is a huge gap there. So I appreciate your bringing it up.
Thank you.
Great. So Bill, I'll just throw out something to the group as well, or just in the group setting that we've talked a little bit about, which is approaches, methodology, technologies, and so on. So I'm just screen sharing something that I presented earlier in the day as well. It's some work that's being done with the Polder group as well as semantics group and so on, where we're looking at documenting the data, we're calling the data ecosystem, and this visualization here, which is not perfectly captured in this context, but is a visualization of metadata catalogs in the polar sort of domain, and how they're sharing data and so on, whether that be presently, in the past or planning and so on. And This is using the linked open data model that I talked about that's come up in our previous session. And here it's quite a well-developed model at this point, if not familiar to everybody. But thinking about those types of things relatively early on as well, I think could be helpful because it can really open up a lot of flexibility, and it connects to the semantics working group in terms of the vocabularies, but it's also a way of getting the data out there and published in a certain way that can give you some more flexibility that is more ideal for things like network representation than tabular data. So, and I see your hand is raised. Go ahead.
So a lot of this has wonderfully come out of what Polder pulled together as the matrix. Like many of you are familiar with the matrix, and there's 2 white papers coming out of that. But for example, in the matrix and also in this visualization are a smaller number, but there are metadata catalogs, source catalogs, as well as aggregating catalogs that relate not so much to the data set world, but to the asset world that have these linkages for interoperability as shown here.
Great. So that was just a sort of a note going forward as well, and just really reiterating what Matt's saying or seconding what he's saying about staying connected. So we did have a relatively formal agreement between CON and ADC a couple of years ago when we were starting down this road. But now that it's more developed, that's something that I mentioned to Sandy this morning. We should think about sort of making more clear so that it's clear that we have a connection and a mandate.
So Peter, can I use that as a way to also talk about how we could build this grassroots sort of approach? That the Polder effort to create the data matrix was fantastic. It was really, a lot of people contributed to that and created the matrix and sort of crowdsourced it into existence. And then you took that and formalized it into what you just called a linked open data graph. But I don't think that your graph is actually a linked open data graph because it's really a centralized graph that you didn't harvest from the linked cloud. So all of the repositories and aggregators that are in that graph know who they participate with, and that those networks are changing fairly rapidly over time. But the Polder matrix is a relatively static snapshot of what that world looked like. I think if we were to really think about how to grow that network, we could take your work on formalizing the vocabulary around that and ask people to incorporate that into, for example, their schema.org catalog descriptions, so that you really could harvest in a linked open data approach the information that's coming from that distributed network and keep it up to date in real time, compared to like the much more curatorial approach that we've taken, which I think was really necessary to get it off the ground. But nevertheless, I think there was still distance to go. And it's a relatively simple step to create, for example, a repository description that adds the vocabulary into your catalog or other resource that's in this ecosystem so that it's available for harvesting. So I'd love to see us sort of take that next step as a community and start to basically take the modeling that came out of the Polder exercise and reintroduce it back into the data ecosystem.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Matt. The chapter that goes with that visualization put together sort of sees that as the long-term goal. We all know inventories and those types of things that have a very short shelf life or duration of relevancy. And I think, following what we've talked about earlier is just finding those few first adopters or initial adopters who are willing to go that route, and then starting to show people the value of it. The one that I just showed you, I think just because it's actually alive, so to speak, it has now resulted in a space agency has just contracted to develop the visualization side of it a bit more, and they're actually doing some surveys within their community and so on and using it because they said, oh, well, this is the kind of thing we want to do. But yeah, it's not always clear to them that it's not a sustainable model just to do it, like you said, with the curation approach. So that would be something I think that would be great to have on our work plan. And I know we talked about that in Geneva as well during the workshop there, that came up, and also possibly linking it to other initiatives that are doing these types of things. Any other comments, questions, anything related to Bill's initiative? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for that. It was really great conversation, and I hope useful for you, Bill. I'd like to come back a little bit to the general conversation about federated search, schema.org work, and just, some of the questions I put forward at the beginning of the session around, where we're at, where we need to go, visions, how we want to do that, etc. I know a few people on the call are involved in that effort, and either more broadly and collaborating, or through your own data center. And I just wanted to see, we touched on this in our first session earlier today, but maybe repeat that and go into a little bit more depth about where we need to be going there. And so I'll open to volunteers to start, anybody who's working in that space of federated search and schema.org in particular. Ruth? Go ahead, Ruth.
Okay. Yeah, no, it took me a second to figure out how to unmute. A little bit brain dead. So this has been a good discussion, but I do think that it's all interrelated in that I think Matt was talking about, using even, for example, schema.org as a way of advertising this kind of information. Currently, the schema.org is really focused on primarily data sets, but also some limited information about repositories. But there's no reason why that couldn't be expanded to other areas, such as those Bill's mentioning. But there's also the added issue that the groups who are heavily involved in documenting the schema.org, best practices for the, or any practices, I guess, for the earth sciences, that group is very technical, and it does not have a lot of the data management type expertise that is needed to ensure that the repositories, the matrix people have been talking about, has like 80 repositories on it. That all 80 of those are, participating in, understand what is coming out of that group, and have, the ability to actually implement it, or even understand what various components are. And that is my biggest concern with moving forward, is actually ensuring that those communications happen. And that's where we were starting to discuss earlier today. And the idea of perhaps coming up with a mechanism to bring those groups together on a regular basis to work through that was brought up. So that's kind of a summary of how we got started with that and my thoughts on it. So.
Great, thank you, Ruth, for that. I'll just add there maybe a question for you and for others is, we've had a number of, I think, very good and productive interactions in the last couple of years through our hands-on workshops, our in-person workshops in the polar community. But those are challenging to organize. They take resources, travel, they have a carbon footprint, etc. Given your experience in particular, Ruth, in doing this sort of thing, how productive do you think we could be in trying to do that in some replication of that type of work online if we were to have the same people organizing that, but organizing web format like this?
The real issue is getting people's time and availability and attention. For example, I brought this up to the Data Stewardship Committee of ESIP because there's data managers there that clearly should be involved. But again, there's this boundary problem of communicating across the boundaries. And in this case, the boundary between the technical groups who might implement whatever is done in schema.org and the data management people who should be defining and saying, yes, all the repositories agree, we're gonna, write our DOIs this way. It's gonna have HTTPS:// on the front of it. And that's, I think, a hard sell. And I think actually I see that Mark Parsons is commenting that these concerns, go across all of these things. But I'm not sure that I have ready answers. I do think that it's the only way forward that I can think of at the moment that has some possibility of working.
Okay, thank you. I see Matt has raised his hand. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Matt.
so I've been trying to engage in that process myself. The Science on Schema.org group is, I think, Ruth, it really is a group of people that are heavily involved in data management, but it's not as broad as I really think it needs to be. So I think you're right in the sense that we really need to make sure that the broader community of data managers, both in the case of Science on Schema.org, both within the Arctic, but also more broadly across data systems, is heavily involved in the decision making there. But it's hard to get people to engage. The technical barriers that you raise are definitely part of the issue. But I think, just getting people to come to some of the meetings and diversify the participation would go a long ways towards changing the sort of perception on whether that activity is for everybody. So, for example, if the guide, which is meant to be, pretty approachable, isn't approachable enough, then I think one way to do that is to try to use that online venue to try to get some more voices in there and help edit it. But it does take an investment of time and effort. And I think the people that you see participating are the people that have sort of stepped up and spend time doing it. And you're one of those great people that has invested time into it. So I saw a few people after the Polar Data Forum in Helsinki. I saw a handful of people from this community join the Science on Schema.org activities, either through the Slack channel or through the GitHub issue tracker and stuff like that. But there hasn't been a lot of engagement on specifically what this community needs in terms of data description and federated search. That it's been a relatively quiet interaction. So, if we could figure out a way to open that discussion up, and it doesn't always have to be technical. I think we just have a self-selecting group that is fairly technical there, but it doesn't have to stay that way, right?
I agree with that. I also note that the biggest problem is that in Helsinki, we came up with like 18 or 19 things that needed to be done to make the schema.org guidance more useful. And one of those things was basically to write a data manager's version of that guidance. And unfortunately, that was not a funded project. So it's not happening.
Yeah. and I think a lot of this is not funded. I think the stuff that is happening is because people, have the resources to basically invest in something that's important to them. And I think we need people to step up and step into those roles and help create those documents. And like, I totally appreciate your statement about, you know, how approachable or unapproachable some of this stuff is, but it's ultimately these different projects, you know, choosing to invest time in the shared activities like that that moves them forward.
Agreed. And I guess what I'm saying is that I don't have any of those projects. and I've been pushing this fairly heavily, but I don't know how long I can do that without more step up from other communities.
So Ruth, I'll jump in there to say that there's been some recent conversations, it's come up in a number of meetings as well, about, you know, the importance of the bottom up, and definitely the volunteerism that is always going to be required. I mean, that happens in the data community, happens in science community, et cetera. But at some point, you know, that hits a wall, or you can only go so far with that. And so it's also then engaging, and this comes back to our point earlier of having these conversations in a broader context, to ensure that those who are either leading funded projects who may not be down in the weeds recognize the importance and will sign off to say, yes, you can spend X number of days a year to contribute to something like this for our good and the greater good, as well as the funders. So that's what we tried to do in the last AOS and a number of meetings where we're trying to send those messages, and we'll try and do that with the statement as well, so that it becomes a legitimate, you know, fundable activity as opposed to sort of a side of the desk type thing. So any other thoughts on that would be welcome as well, because I think it's part of the broader discussion that we need to have, and where we keep hitting, well, we sometimes hit roadblocks, not always. Matt, is your hand still up, or is it up again? Okay, I'll just.
Sorry.
Right. Just for those involved, then, is it a accurate characterization to say that we're making some progress, but that it's being slowed down partly due to the issues we just talked about, you know, documentation and so on, and perhaps just not as much engagement kind of after the party, so to speak, the Helsinki initiative? You know, are there others who have been engaged who could comment?
So I'll just say, this is Matt, I'll just say there has been a little bit of engagement. There's a core group of between 5 and 10 people that have really consistently been investing time in it. And the group is very welcoming of other people coming in and providing perspectives. There's a process in place to try to improve the guidance, and everybody's welcome to come and edit the guidance on how to build this interoperability layer, and make suggestions on how it could be improved. So it is a pretty small group at this point that's really actively engaging. But
so a question, your opinion and others is, do you feel it would be a welcome, you know, this smaller group that you have going would welcome something like an organized, you know, hackathon-like webinar, maybe a few hours, that the Polar community promotes, pushes, organizes, and tries to pull some time from that group in? Because one of the things I experience is, you know, sometimes it's just people don't feel, because they don't know the group, they've not met these people, they're not, you know, they're new, they're thinking, oh, you know, am I just going to come in and maybe ask questions that don't make a lot of sense or whatever. Whereas having some engagement helps that. I know it certainly helped with Helsinki with some of the people in our team in Canada. They're feeling more comfortable, and although they're still ramping up, they've talked about, okay, you know, when are we going to go back to the group? Do you think that if it's ESIP, I'm not sure if that would be the group to approach about this, but something that would also help us maybe to break down the silo a bit?
yeah, absolutely. I think the people that are involved would welcome, you know, either smaller or even domain focused sort of reviews of things, and getting together. I think people would be happy to participate in those. I know I would. I think some of the other folks, like Stephen Richards, he's been heavily involved in the Antarctic data catalog in the U.S. and is heavily involved in the schema.org stuff. So I think there's definitely interest there. Adam Shepard, who's been sort of leading the whole science on schema.org thing for ESIP, is a data manager and runs the biological and chemical oceanography data management office with a lot of Arctic data in it. So I think there's a lot of interest, and I think people would be willing. There's twice monthly calls to try to make progress, and people are welcome to join those. But we could also set up and participate in, for example, a polar or Arctic call if that was a more comfortable venue.
Okay, and maybe not exclusive, but just something that we could try and get our people going and get them out to something. If we could say, hey, this one is definitely for you. I see a number of hands, so I'm just going to start with actually Jonathan, and then Amber, then Ruth, just because just to give a little breadth there. So Jonathan.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I think for some reason we are focusing on research assets, and I know that there's a very active citizen science component to this community. Also, in the United States, we have a new open government data law that requires us to do a heck of a lot of user engagement. And so it's the purpose of data management is not so we can do more research or we can feed the scientists who want to get publications. The law actually says our fundamental responsibility is to the public who's funding the science, and to make their needs our top priority. So I think if we reframe it in that context, it does two things. It gives us, I read the chat from Lil. So we've got to kind of think about this a little differently, and maybe part of the problem we're having with the finding the hands to do the heavy lifting is because we're going back to the research community over and over again, and they should be doing research. We really need to open this up to do crowdsourcing or whatever to get this the societal benefit of this really expanded, to engage the public, and to focus on products for people that they can use in their daily lives. Not, it's great to do this for national assessments or international assessments, but fundamentally, if data does not address a person's need, it's not useful. And we have to come to terms with that.
So Jonathan, I'll just ask there though, what's your sort of thinking or vision around how the data that may be collected, for science would explicitly or directly meet the end user or the public end user need? Are you thinking about some sort of mediated form, or do you not see the value? Sorry, go ahead.
The example is Weather Service. That data is used in a variety of ways, and it's probably primarily for public consumption. I'm not saying that all of a sudden all of our Arctic research will turn into a weather service or that kind of activity, but I just feel like we can take the research that's being funded right now for scientific reasons and really open it up to a broader community for their use and for informing their day-to-day activities. And it's just there seems to be a problem with the way information is disseminated. That if we could overcome that barrier, perhaps we could also realize some benefits in terms of funding for basic data management. And it'll kind of grow. There'll be a feedback because more people will want to see more data. and also, you know, going to the funding organizations, you're just going back to the well. You have to think broader. So engaging with industry and nonprofit organizations. We can't just stay in our research community and think that's the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when I said funding organizations, I wasn't limiting to research funding. And right now I have 4 different types of funders, for example. So I definitely agree there. And that's going to be more and more important going forward. I'll just turn to Amber.
I was just going to circle back to what Matt was talking about with respect to the hackathon concept and having a polar focused one, and also what Ruth was talking about within ESIP. So Ruth and I have been working in the data stewardship committee within ESIP, primarily Ruth, and I've taken over some responsibility, and we've been approaching evaluation of these fields with the non-technical community, and our next step is to actually move this into more of an integrated broad community for a hackathon style event, because within our monthly meetings we have a situation where, you know, we have new people, we have to go through the kind of preliminary information route again to get people on the same stage. And so having a hackathon across the ESIP community is something that we are planning in the next few months as a way to bring these audiences together and to dedicate a chunk of time to get more momentum and forward trajectory on this. And I think having a breakout that might be focused on the polar community could be something that we incorporate within that. So I'd be happy to work with people from this community in terms of kind of making that happen and trying to get that recognition in the community and get a good buy-in for this.
Great, thank you. Go back to Ruth and then back to Jonathan. If your hand is, yeah, re-raised, Jonathan. So go ahead, Ruth.
Okay, so 2 points. To Jonathan, I think a lot of the issue is data that is coming out of research projects or even government projects. As designed by the community trying to get that data, is generally built for that community. In other words, if that's a science community, it'll be geared towards whatever that science question is. And the problem is that to make it more generally useful to the broader community, you actually have to make products that are useful to that community. And again, that's a translation problem, because often, and there are several people here on the call who know this well and have written papers on it. But that again is a funding issue. So that's one comment, Jonathan. The other comment is not really towards Jonathan's comments, but it's about what needs to happen. The big issue is there needs to be enough actual writing support, for the data management community to get, actually a useful document for that community written that is accessible to that community. Again, a translation problem. And to do that, is going to take significant effort. So if we could hold, for example, a hackathon that, say, addressed pick any issue, identifiers or something, in gory detail, and actually wrote those instructions, that would be much better than, for example, what we did in Helsinki, which is we created like 19 or 20 issues about things that need to change with the documentation, but did not actually provide the updated documentation that was needed. And so that's, again, another translation process. People are currently participating, in that cluster, I don't think are the appropriate people to write that data management version of the best practices and stuff, because that does not need to have quite the technical detail, but it has to have more specificity.
So Ruth, I'm just adding my support to those comments, and actually I very much agree with your comments, Jonathan. Something I've sort of thought a lot about, and many of us here have thought a lot about, is this idea, I call it, along with Mark and some others, mediation, there's transformation, there's different ways. Knowledge mobilization is one that we talk about. And so I think it's there, but it's under-resourced. There's not enough attention paid to it. And this is coming back, I think, to this venue or this forum comments that we talked about earlier that I was making too about, is it the right audience? So this is where I think these issues come up a lot in broader audiences, because you do have different viewpoints and different requirements and stakeholders and rights holders, et cetera, around the table. So I think the more that we can do that, the better. At the same time, I know as somebody who's been involved in trying to sort of coordinate some of this, we also have a lot of messages from people in the community saying, hey, I am a technician, I need to think about how to do this, down in the weeds. We need more time to work together. And so this is where I think we have this balancing act of how do we provide those venues, those spaces for all of this to happen, and make sure that the proper attention is being paid across the board. So those are some notes I'm making in terms of our putting together a statement that we want to make sure that we're not too heavily weighted in one direction or the other. And I know personally I'm starting to think now, would I be better to sort of step back from some of this work and focus more, given a new position, on writing and students, because I now have students, and Pierre brought that up. So that strategizing around that, I think, would be helpful either here or in the future, is what is the best way to keep that all moving. And Jonathan or others, Mike, I see made some comments as well. If you have some specific thoughts, I'll come to you in just a sec, Mark, on some of the ways you're seeing this happening. I mean, I've certainly been involved in projects where we've done, formal needs analysis. I know others on the call have done that sort of thing. But any sort of thoughts there too about how you'd envision it? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I just wanted to echo what you were saying about getting something into the end document from this summit, because this has been a theme for a long time, that it's always difficult to get resources for coordination, mediation, translation, but it's essential, and I think it's becoming increasingly essential as we're looking at more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary issues. Students are great. I think we should take advantage of those, of students, and increase, like I think Pierluigi said, the sort of educational base as we go forward. So, but ultimately this needs to be done by professionals. This needs to be recognized as a professional skill that enables interoperability. These mediators and coordinators, not necessarily the same people, need to be supported. And I think that's something that should come out strongly in our statement at the end.
Great, thank you, Mark. Any other comments? Mark, or sorry, Matt.
So I'll just follow up on this idea that we need more money for mediation and collaboration among the community, and I think that's true. But we've also, I think, historically spent a lot of time and raised a lot of money to run workshops that are face-to-face workshops, which are very useful, but there's a limited number you can have during a year. We all have really busy travel schedules, and adding, an additional set is really tough. The Science on Schema.org group is meeting bi-monthly, for 1 hour a week, basically every other week or every third week or so. And we couldn't achieve that level of consistency if we were trying to do it face-to-face. So I really recommend that we try to find ways to use our really, effective virtual environments to increase the frequency of contact and try to focus less on talking about what the issues are and how we can make, again, small incremental changes that really help move things forward. I think trying to bring the whole problem down, in one fell swoop in a big design is a really tough thing to do. It's a big distributed, complicated system, but we can all contribute little parts that really, if we work like online together, it really works well. I've been really enjoying the collaboration on science on schema.org, and I think that it's the right way to kind of work bottom up.
Thank you, Matt, and I definitely support that idea. I've been really, really pleased at seeing, some of these virtual activities, the semantics group. We've had a few misses here and there, but generally, we're keeping a small but productive group together and starting to think, okay, how can we apply this, and starting to see some applications. And definitely in terms of the level of effort required, many of us on the call have been involved in organizing workshops. We know what that takes, not only to run it, but also to do the follow-up. And more and more, I'm also thinking about carbon footprint. And so I think if nothing good can come out of this COVID thing, or if one good thing can come out of it, is it might get us more into that culture of being able to be productive in this way. So I would certainly like to follow up in our statement and after this, certainly for the Arctic Data Committee and some related projects on how we do that. I note that Shannon has raised her hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's been a little bit tough to participate and also try and take notes at the same time. So sorry for being so quiet, everybody. I just wanted to echo the statement on the virtual environments to increase frequency of contact that Matt mentioned and Peter just mentioned again. I'm finding, for example, this session that we're currently in, a great way to work. I was not going to be able to participate in the Actuary conference, the AOS, simply because of funding through the university. But now I can participate because it's virtual, so that's excellent. I also wanted to touch on some of Ruth's comments about connecting, well, not just Ruth's comments, but connecting data managers, not just technical people. I am actually a data manager, not a technical person, and I have to say I have found some of the hackathons a bit intimidating for my level of technical knowledge. And I do think that write-ups and things that are more geared towards data managers would help, but it also requires people like myself to push themselves a little bit to understand the technical a little bit better. Because the more I've talked to and engaged in the non-semantic technical components, the easier it's been for me to participate in some of these sessions.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Any other comments, questions? Jonathan, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so that was, Shannon, that was a good comment, particularly on the role for the non-technical data manager. There is a precedent, I'd say, or a best practice in industry where you have, a software development firm. They have very technical staff, and they're busy with the back end, getting things working and updating it continuously. But then you have the business liaisons, the people who are out there translating the software for the user. And I think, for lack of a better word, data manager might fit into that category. But, maybe we need to, I know this isn't as incremental as someone else might like, but we need to really kind of define what these roles are. And you could have a data manager serving a particular community and being the translator, and finding ways to fund that person through non-conventional means. But the need has to first be identified in that proposal needs to be created so that people realize there is the need to translate the technical guidance to something that's the users can use more easily. Yeah, I was just thinking of my cousin who works for a technical, a big software firm based in Germany. He's in the US, but his dad was a computer science geek, so he kind of picked up some skills. But his real strength is he's a good people person. He's just kind of easygoing, friendly, and that's his strongest asset. So, those skill sets don't always overlap in the technical community, and there are some people that do everything. But I think it's very rare to find these people who can translate well from between the two areas. And really defining the need for these people, maybe hiring them, putting them in organizations that will host them. I think that's a very productive means to make progress.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Other questions, comments, thoughts on these topics or others? So I'm definitely hearing some of the same messages around not only the technical, certainly we've had a number of technical issues, but these broader issues as well about relationship with users, resourcing, how we connect as a community, how we expand our connections, and to ensure our community is not strictly one type of individual, one role. And that I think we're making progress on, but we definitely need to continue that. One thing I note is that we're having discussions now and starting to move towards what Mark pointed out importantly in the chat is the users and use cases, and we're getting some things that are a bit more concrete. So one example is it's in the early stages, but there's a group of data folks, whether they be developers or data managers and others, who are now starting to work quite closely within an IASC initiative called T-Mosaic. So it's a build on from the Mosaic initiative, but looking at terrestrial. So it's early days, and unfortunately that project has just had to extend by a year because of the COVID situation and the cancellation of field season essentially. But we have some opportunity there to say, okay, it's not just the data managers sitting over here and talking about things and scientists or the community members engaging, sitting over there. It gives us a space to work in together. So I'm looking forward to continuing that and also finding those opportunities so that we're not working as a data team, but as an overall team. So there's opportunity here, I think, as well as we think about what's happening in Working Group 3 in particular, in the AOS, but also with all of the other AOS working groups, because I think they're all having discussions that in some way would connect to us. So I think that's something I definitely have highlighted for our working sessions, where we're going to be working on the paper or the statement. So in this session, I wanted to touch on federated search and related. So we had a lot of discussion on that, and we're coming up on about 2 hours. We do potentially have 3, but as I said, we don't necessarily need to go the full 3. We also had semantics on the agenda. That's come up a number of times. Knowing that we have a number of people here working in that area, did we want to spend a little bit of time talking about doing the updates, current developments, priorities, partners, etc., or do we feel that that's been covered through our existing conversation or our previous conversation?
Peter, this is Matt. I'd love to get an update. I haven't been able to engage in the polar semantics calls as much recently, and so I'd love to kind of hear a summary from those of you who have as to where things are at and where things are going.
Great.
Okay. So this is Ruth. I co-chair that group, and I don't see Oystein on, so I guess it'll have to be me. That group is continuing its series of monthly telecons. There were several activities ongoing. We've pretty much stopped. Well, we haven't. If you know of specific semantic type resources, controlled vocabularies, ontologies, whatever, and want to contribute to them to the compilation that we're coming up with, please continue to do so. I probably can find the links somewhere and paste it in, or perhaps Shannon can do that. I'm not good at talking and finding things. And are turning now to actually collating all of that information and doing some sort of paper about it, some sort of summary. A lot of the activities that's going on in that group are sort of just keeping everybody apprised of various activities that all of the members are aware of globally and how that is impacting, you know, various communities. So a lot of our conversation is around that. We have in that community started talking about going through the schema.org materials from that lens, and perhaps that could be done in conjunction with the hackathons or whatever that comes out of this, and the ESIP data stewardship stuff that Amber was talking about a little bit earlier. So that, I think, is all good. I will say in the ESIP arena, there is an ongoing hackathon series that is trying to bring the earth sciences and the environmental sciences together in the ENVO and suite ontologies, and with the GCW glossary work as well. Thank you, Shannon. So there's a lot of work happening there, and it is moving forward, but as you might expect, that has the same person power issues as everything else.
Great, thank you, Ruth. I might just add in there as well, I've been participating in the group as best I can. We're also starting to see connections to some real world applications, or we're just about to do that. I note that, and I'll put Nick on the spot, Nick Brown is here. Nick's with the new Permafrost Net, which is a network in Canada focused on permafrost. CCADI has been working a bit with that network, and we're continuing to work with them, but there have been conversations with Nick and his team at PermafrostNet about vocabularies, and I've pointed to the work that's being done under ENVO and through the semantics working group as well, some of that work, and have invited him to attend our next meeting. But what we're starting to see now, I think, is the opportunity, and again with Bill's work potentially, of some really good use cases, so that we can really focus the work and start to understand how we can, move forward on very practical applications. And that will continue to emerge through our CCADI project as well. We have 3 science use cases that we're developing, and all 3 of those, including the one that has permafrost involved, will require vocabularies, semantics, and so on, and we have some resources to put towards that. So I'm very much going to, not push, but ensure that that's being done through this collaboration that we have in the group, because I think it's working well, and it seems to be at the right level of right scale or level of collaboration, that things get done, but we also have all those connections to other initiatives that are going on around the world.
So I just put a little comment in the chat about this, about, one of the things that we're struggling with in our semantic implementation is mature vocabularies. And I've been really hoping that groups would, start to nominate vocabularies for usage. We've been using Envo and EXO extensively. Envo's really mature and obviously a great candidate. But there's, for at least the data that we hold in the Arctic Data Center, there's just this huge disciplinary breadth of needs, especially when we're talking about things like vocabularies for measurements. And so I've been sort of hoping that the Polar Semantics group would be blessing additional vocabularies and really coming out with those. Do you guys feel like the vocabularies have matured to a level that they can be broadly adopted and they're stable enough to be used in production systems?
I would have to say that some are, particularly the W3C things, ENVO. In other areas like Suite, etc., there's a lot of work happening there. Stable is not the word I would use because there is a lot of work happening there. In terms of parameters and variables, we're back to IADOPT again. And there's at least a half a dozen different groups kind of going down the same path with different versions of it. Some of them are more adopted than others, even though others might perhaps be more rigorously defined. And I don't know that the Arctic group has the ability to really pick winners, if that's the way to put it. I'm not sure that that's our purpose. Pierre, go right ahead.
Go ahead, Pierre.
Thanks. This is a problem that we all face, because again, we can do quite a lot of stuff from ontologies like Envo, but as Matt said, it's out of our scope and actually against the rules of the federation we're in to kind of have mission creep to other domains. But some positive progress on that side. Recently at this USTTS semantics conference, we got ESIP, Semantic Technology Committee, and the OBO Foundry operations people to meet, to talk, to exchange ideas. And there are efforts now to set up the Earth Observation Foundry, or not, we won't call it a foundry, we'll probably call it a federation because we're sci-fi geeks, right? In the ESIP Federation. And that's probably going to be where we're starting to position different resources from vocabularies to ontologies and thesauri, and start a quality control procedure that'll help us then identify those things that are mature. We can start systematically rating them. So I'm hopeful that will be a forum where we can gather up all of this community activity and approach it a little bit more systematically. But right now, yeah, as Ruth said, it's just quite a lot of effort. Most of it is there, papers come out and then those things disappear. Very few are interested in actually developing production grade systems at this stage. And if we find them, I think we should certainly share them among this group so that we can work with them and elevate the whole field.
Thanks to both of you. Are there any other comments or thoughts with respect to the semantics work?
Yeah, I just have kind of a naive question. This is Mark again. It seems to me it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, whether something is adopted and robust before you adopt it, you know what I mean? That it doesn't get adopted until you adopt it. And that the actual adoption actually makes it more robust. And so I think it's odd, for example, that, Suite is, yeah, it's clearly still evolving, but it's built off of a very long-standing set of vocabularies that used to be routinely implemented in polar data systems, the GCMD vocabularies. So it seems like in some ways we're going backwards. Why wouldn't we want, why would you not recommend the adoption of Suite right now? I guess is sort of my ultimate naive question.
Only because I think he was looking for something that's fairly stable. I will note that while Suite is based on the GCMD vocabularies, there was a period when Suite was not being maintained, but the vocabularies changed quite a bit. So there has been a divergence. I think there's beginning to be more of a reconvergence again. But I also note that the vocabularies themselves are becoming a new entity. So it's a moving space.
Yeah, it seems that sometimes you just got to grab what's there, though. But yeah, anyway.
I do think people are doing that, and I do think that the Suite work that is happening is trying very hard to improve that system and not break anything that's already based on it. But clearly, as they upgrade Suite, you know, other systems will have to, you know, at some point at least, update their use of Suite. So.
And it seems like there's a convergence between Suite and Envo in the sense that it seems like Suite was a much less formal approach to sort of covering a lot of the same domain space. And I think Envo leapfrogged ahead of that. And now there's kind of a harmonization effort. It seems like Lewis's work on Suite has been really welcomed, but also people recognize that there were limits to the original design of the vocabulary. It was much more of a hierarchical keywords list than really a formal vocabulary. So yeah, so I think that there's probably going to be continued. I mean, Pierre, I don't know if you can speak to this. It seems like you've been right in the middle of all that with the group that's been doing it. But what is the direction for Suite now in light of Envo and that stuff?
Right, so like I wear two hats from this. One on the ESIP side, I'm the co-chair of the Semantic Tech Committee. So I carry the Suite flag and the ESIP flag. And then I'm also on the Obo Foundry Operations Committee. So that's the Envo space. And really they're different things. As you said, Suite right now is more of a hierarchical keywords list. But it's a good one. It's sketched out the scope of Earth observation semantics, where it should go. So that's what I'm excited about right now, because we're using that as the kind of framework within which we can build this federation of different vocabularies and ontologies that go way beyond Envo. So Envo is about environments and environmental systems, which is part of what Suite references with its vocabularies. Yes, we have more terms in Envo, but only within that domain. So Envo can do some semantic heavy lifting for users who need that. Suite can't do that, but it sketched out a much broader space, which we'll use as the sort of framework to grow this thing into a more mature set. And that's again why I keep focusing on the next generation, because there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of things to bring in, like the sensor ontologies, like SSO and SOS frameworks that will work for that community and bridge the two. So that's how it's kind of working. They're merging together. Ruth's work on the Arctic vocabularies or polar vocabularies. It's our semantic harmonization work. That's how we're mapping Envo and Suite in some terms. We'll make it sort of backwards compatible in the sense that if you're using those Suite terms, a machine will be able to hop over to the Envo term to do semantic heavy lifting if you need it. And if you don't, you're fine using the Suite term. So we're thinking about that. And that's like that theme of making sure that the interoperability resources are themselves interoperating. So Lewis and the ESIP community have been great on this. Obo's also like really willing to bridge that gap. So I see a good amount of convergence possible.
Thanks, that was really helpful, y'all. I guess it just strikes me that this is similar to the sort of schema.org question that we were having before, is that it's an ongoing need for repositories, data managers to improve the interoperability of their systems, but while still working in established constraints of what their current systems can currently handle and what they're willing to commit to and what they have resources to commit to adopt new technologies or approaches that will increase their interoperability. And people are loath to jump on anything too quickly. And yeah, anyway, it seems it's sort of, that to me, it strikes me as that's sort of the Uber question. And I'm not sure you know, we can have all the workshops and hackathons in the world, but unless people take it home and actually implement, we don't actually achieve the ultimate goal. So.
No, absolutely. And we don't want to have more work on the data manager side. They shouldn't have to re-annotate if possible, right? So we really have to keep that in mind, because otherwise it's just going to be hopping to the next thing, and it won't go anywhere.
But that said, you know, metadata cleanup and management is just like a perpetual chore.
Sure, sure. We just have to minimize it, though.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I see Jonathan.
Yeah, I have a general observation with it, that this is very North America weighted discussion. Maybe, you know, people are representing international groups, and that's fine. But in particular, I wonder how that perspective is weighting the discussion on schema.org. Is that an international standard? Or have those of us in North America see that as a comfortable area to work in? But how would that be received in Europe, in Asia? And I don't know if that's really an appropriate question for this forum, but there are other perspectives on the phone, and I think it'd be worth it to open it up some more.
I think that's a good point, Jonathan. Ruth, and then maybe Pierre, as somebody based in Europe as well, I'd maybe point to you, and then anyone else. I notice Peter Kirsch and some others in the European space are with us.
So I know that one of the reasons why the Science on Schema.org group has 2 different calls is they're at different times, because the community is global. For example, people from Australia often are on some of those calls. And Pierre is, after all, in Germany. No, where are you, Pierre?
Yeah, Germany.
So I do see international interest in that. It is not a US-centric thing. It is a global organization with participants as broadly construed. And I mean broadly in that, you know, movie theaters use it, restaurants use it. And so, yeah, I do think that it's a fairly broad audience. Could it be broader? Definitely. I think we've heard some of the issues bringing repositories and observatories and sites and things like that into it. But I do think that that's all possible and should happen. That's just my perspective.
I notice Pierre has made some comments. I would just add as well, I think, Jonathan, one of the reasons why the interest in schema.org in particular is just because of the broader interest. So in the workshop that I mentioned that was in Geneva, I guess late 2018, we had been talking about federated search, and that was the first time that I had seen anyway in probably about 15 years of activity with the Arctic community, that every representative in the room said that they would get behind that in the coming year and a half. I'm not sure if that's entirely happened, but I think it was a good point of connection, partly also because it's relatively lightweight. It's not as heavy as some of the other implementations. Any other comments on that, on Jonathan's question around the applicability internationally? Okay, I see Nick Brown. Please go ahead, Nick.
Hey, this is actually looping back a little while to Pierre's comment about, looking for people who are setting up a production grade system, and at PermafrostNet, I'm still not super familiar with what that would look like, but I was wondering, Pierre, if you wouldn't mind just elaborating a little bit on what you mean by what a production grade system might look like and how that could tie into the work at ENVO.
Sorry, the work at what? I missed the last bit of that.
The ENVO semantic
okay.
work.
All right. So one of the main things for what I consider production grade, or operations grade is more accurate, is that the project is going to survive multiple rounds of funding. So even if it's not funded, it doesn't stop working, which often means you have to externalize the hosting to something like a federation or a community that supports it. So that's why ENVO is in the OVO Foundry. They run the servers for the IRIs, et cetera, et cetera. And also that for operations grade, there have to be some sort of best practices and standards of how that thing is developed. It can't be so bespoke that if I stop working on ENVO, then nobody can figure it out. So again, we use the best practices. Any other OBO ontology engineer can pick it up and roll with it. Then it has to have a certain amount of uptime. There has to be a very clear policy for obsoleting terms, how they're replaced, how machines should read that. So basically, creating those sort of standards that somebody like an industrial partner would be able to say, okay, yeah, we can use that. It's predictable enough that we've covered the cases that could be potential threats to system stability. Those are the main principles. Of course, there's much more to say, but that's the main thing.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Pierre. Any other questions or comments, particularly related to semantics, but anything else is okay as well?
I think it's good. So the work that we're doing with semantic harmonizations, led by Ruth's work on the Global Cryosphere Watch initiative, like bringing together all of these different definitions of stuff. I think that's where semantics are really needed by the community, not so much in casting stable or known vocabularies into machine readable form, but really at looking at where the community has defined the same thing really differently and figuring out technical ways to help resolve that issue. And also where people they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're talking about completely different ones. I think, those are the cases I think we should highlight when we're reaching out to broader communities to say what the utility of semantic technology is. Because often people are left scratching their head, but it's really, Ruth has like so many examples, it's despairing. But I think a lot of those calls are recorded and our progress is recorded there too. So I think it's a nice focus.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on that? I would say that this is something that I've been aiming to communicate within a number of projects, is what it really takes to move forward, and that it's one thing to do the technical work and get it set up. It's another thing to actually do the semantics, to think about the definitions and relationships and so
Absolutely.
on. And so I don't do that to scare people off, but also just to make it clear, what it takes. One thing I'd also like to just raise my hand or give credit to Pierre and others in that group on is grounding this work. So I know, for a number of years I've been working at my desktop in Protege, et cetera, and coming up with ontologies and ideas and so on. But to see how it has been done in ENVO in terms of the workflow, the ability to do that kind of work, but then put it into a repository, have community members vet and look at it not only from a semantic perspective, but structural perspective and so on, I think is really valuable. And there's, I think a YouTube video where I acted as a guinea pig and some others, on how to do that. And that's the kind of thing that I think can really take us forward, because it makes it much more concrete for practitioners who want to get involved and just don't know how to do so. Okay, we're moving along. Are any other comments, thoughts, questions in relation to the semantics aspect of the session? Okay, and I'm just going to fill some space here, just a moment, Ruth, and say, Pierre mentioned that it's coming, some of this is coming out of the OBO Foundry, but it highlights the importance of these, connectors, mediators, and so on, and the ability to have people bring things from the outside into our community. So that comes back to earlier discussions in this session and the session 1 as well, but I think really highlights the importance and the value of doing that sort of connection. So I'll go to Ruth and then Shannon.
I had a really short comment, which is basically, so there is this vocabularies and semantics working group, and if you're interested in sort of keeping touch with what's going on in that space, Shannon a little earlier in the chat put a link to that group, and it is totally open, and it would be very lovely to have more participation from practically anywhere. That's all I had to say.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And Shannon.
Well, as another member of that group, I'll agree with Ruth. We can always use the help. Just a note that I wanted to make, Peter, when I was talking in the chat with things like ESIP, it might be useful for some of our participants to create, and I'm sorry to suggest this because it's probably going to be me that ends up doing it, a very brief glossary of terms, especially as it pertains to acronyms. I remember from the Geneva conference when Ruth mentioned ESIP, which was the first time I'd heard of ESIP, that it took me forever to figure out even how to spell it to determine it was an acronym. I'm looking up Aesop's fables on my computer going, that can't be right. And there's a lot of vocabularies and just little things that we take for granted that people in this sphere will know about. But if we're trying to be open to a lot of different people, in particular researchers coming in, it might be helpful to have that kind of a document.
Great, that's an excellent point. Shannon, one thing I would say is actually Heather McFarlane, who's no longer with us, I think, on the call, but who's been instrumental in getting this Arctic Observing Summit off the ground. There is a Google Doc, I know, that was started for the AOS for that exact purpose, because we were recognizing in organizing calls and so on that people were using terms and acronyms that they weren't familiar with. So that might be a good starting point, and then something we might also want to maintain through one of our host organizations, ADC or similar, going forward. And I'll find that link for you and make it available to you and the others.
Thank you, Peter. That would be really helpful.
And at the moment, I won't share it broadly. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a fully open document, but I'll find out and at least share the link with you. Okay, Phil, I see you're back. Welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, I checked in on Working Group 1. They were in breakout sessions. They're going to come back together in 2 minutes as one Working Group 1 observing session. I don't want to derail anything, but do you have your agenda document? If you could share that,
yeah, just a moment. I'll just go back to my screen sharing.
I mean, it's a crazy idea. What if we all moved to that room? But you probably have other things that you want to do.
No, actually, I was just about to see if we were at a point where we wanted to stop our session 2. The only thing I did want to put out before we do that, while I think Lil is still on the line, session 4, the idea was to talk about or focus on emerging technologies, methods, et cetera, including e-science, model-based science, which is something that you brought up at a previous IARPIC meeting. And I'm wondering whether you would be available, and maybe if you don't want to answer here, if you could just email me and let me know, because I think you'd have a lot that you could share with this group on the model-based science work that you're doing. Okay. Okay, does anyone have any objection to Bill's suggestion that we wrap up here, and that for those of you who are interested, we move over to Working Group 1, which is looking at the broader sort of, don't remember the exact name of it, but the broader architecture of the observing system.
Sounds good.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, Bill has put in the link. And with that, I would just say thanks to everybody for the participation, the excellent input. Again, tomorrow, session 3, we want to look at community building, so we could really expand on some of these ideas we've talked about, things about user engagement, all of that. So anyone interested, please join that call if you can. And then the 4th session will be focused more on these emerging technologies, et cetera. So with that, I will call this session to a close, and thank you again, and look forward to seeing you again online.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks, Peter. Good session. Great session.
Okay, thank you all.